You're listening to The Partially Examined Life, a philosophy podcast by some guys who are one point set on doing philosophy for a living, but then thought better of it. Our question for today, episode 65, is something like, what constitutes good government? For this discussion, we read selections of the Federalist Papers by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, which were originally published as newspaper editorials under the pseudonym Publius between October 1787 and May 1788, all in support of the newly proposed American Constitution. We also read two of the letters by Brutus, one of the most articulate and well-regarded anti-federalists and objector to the proposed Constitution. You can get the text, join the discussion, and read loads of supplemental material at partiallyexaminedlife.com. I'm Dylan Casey in Middleton, Wisconsin.
This is Mark Linsenmeyer in Madison, Wisconsin.
And this is Seth Paskin in Austin, Texas.
And this is Wes Alwyn in...
Wes is just taking a break this time.
Yeah.
Shall we give the ground rules for our discussion?
Yes, we can do the ground rules.
All right. Dylan, tell us number one. Are you prepared?
Yes. Try not to assume that our audience has read anything that we're talking about or has any other background in philosophy or the American founding or that sort of stuff.
Or voting.
Yes. Even though in the U.S., they probably took civics if they were in high school and they would have heard of some of this stuff.
A whole class called civics. No, I did not have such a thing.
You didn't? I had government.
We had American history, AP Poli-Sci. Somewhere in there was a political philosophy course, although I'm sure it was not called that, and that's where I read The Republic and things like that. But they didn't give us this. However, I was inspired enough by that class that I wrote a treatise for my teacher on how to fix all of the world's problems.
Wow.
Which, just for the hell of it, because I was a dweeb.
You weren't a snot-nosed undergrad or anything, were you?
This was not undergrad. This is junior in high school, I believe.
You weren't a snot-nosed junior in high school, were you?
I don't think I would have dared do this in an undergrad college setting. And the main point was, if people in a country disagree over stuff, they should just split and make a different country.
Wow.
Because of that, he gave me a copy of this Federalist paper number 10 and said, you should read this. That's not a good idea, what you're proposing.
That's an interesting response to that.
It is. I'm pretty impressed, actually.
Number 2, don't name drop. Just make your point. Don't say, you would understand me if only you'd read Feng Shui for Obsessive Compulsives. Like you have to line up the furniture just so 3 times every time you enter the room. All right, Seth, you give number 3.
Number 3 would be try to be concise and, how do we say it? Try
rigorous to be and exact.
Precise and rigorous and exact in all that we say, unless doing the opposite would be more entertaining.
Very nice. So this is in honor of the election, more or less, right?
Yeah.
Getting all civical. Come on and get civical.
You guys were just talking about your civics classes. I can't recall. I know I studied a lot of this stuff. It was just part of the curriculum. I don't recall there being like one class where we were like, oh, and now we learn about government. It just seems like when I was growing up, everything, like there was always every year there was some kind of class where we had to study something about American government. Am I just blurring because I don't recall the details of my childhood? Or did it used to be different?
It might have varied from, place to place. We had in my high school one dedicated class called government. That was all separation of powers, who's your congressman, how do bills get passed, stuff like that. Everything that you learned from Schoolhouse Rock.
Well, I just have this vague recollection of multiple American history, American government type classes over the course of many years. But I also remember very distinctly Schoolhouse Rock being a critical part of my... In fact, I recently put a post up on the blog about the failure of today's youth to be able to accurately use conjunctions and got a little Schoolhouse Rocky on things.
Wow.
Those of us who do know Schoolhouse Rock know how a bill becomes a law.
Yes.
But we don't know the Federalist Papers because I don't believe there was a Federalist...
No, I think they covered that. I think they covered the Federalist Papers on a special episode of Sesame Street.
With Grover as Alexander Hamilton?
Yes, exactly. And when Romney gets elected and gets rid of PBS, there will be no avenue for children to learn the intricacies of all 85 essays in the Federalist Papers via Big Bird, the Cookie Monster, and Grover, Bert and Ernie.
I want to see Grover have his duel with Aaron Burr and be shot and die.
That's right. Oh, man.
Oh, so sweet. Actually, I was thinking we should substitute for the regular rules this time, the debate rules. 3 15-minute segments, and they'll be divided, and then you'll get to talk for 2 minutes, and you'll get to talk for 2 minutes, and I'll try to interrupt and stop you when you're running out of time. And let's answer all of the questions that each other asks by saying something slightly irrelevant about a man I met in Ohio who had a pet snake who looked very sick. And that pet snake looked up at me and said, "Can you help?"
Banish the factions.
Yes, for people who are listening to this decades in the future, if it's the year 2053 and you're wondering what our obscure references are to, it's the presidential debate between one Mitt Romney and one Barack Obama, which just recently took place.
And they settled it via Schoolhouse Rock. I'm not sure how that works, but
it might have been interesting if they'd settled it via duel the way Burr and Hamilton did.
It'll come to that.
Yeah, that was the good old days when our most highly elected officials had duels to settle their arguments.
Well, I did read about the identity of Brutus.
Yes, Robert Yates. At least that's the best guess.
Yeah, and after this, some years after this, he ran for governor against John Jay, one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, and lost, effectively ending his political career.
Yeah, Yates was one of the 3 guys who was at the Philadelphia Convention from New York, along with Hamilton. And he and the other representative from New York, John Lansing, apparently left in a significant huff, a fury, when they found out that the Articles of Confederation were just going to be scrapped, that there wasn't even going to be really given any attention to revising them. They were mightily pissed.
Maybe it would make sense at that point, Dylan, to just put a little context around this, like when they were written, or at least what's going on at the time and why were they written in the first place and kind of what's happening.
Yeah, so this is the end of 1787 and the beginning, first half of 1788 when the editorials first appeared. And this is on the heels of the proposal for the American Constitution. The country had been united under the Articles of Confederation since just after winning or the end of the Revolutionary War. And there were lots of complaints and problems about the Articles of Confederation, in particular that it basically didn't give any power to the federal government at all. So there were things like self-defense and commerce that were really posing a problem. And so there was a second convention called to deal with that issue. And the outcome of that was the proposed American Constitution, in which there is a much stronger federal government. In fact, it's a federal government, not a Confederate government. And these essays that were collected as the Federalist were originally newspaper editorials that were written in support of the Constitution. So throughout this time, during the discussion of ratification in the fall of 1787 and through 1788, there was this very vigorous discussion throughout the colonies and lots of newspaper articles and editorials, both for and against the Constitution. These were written with a plan in mind by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay. They were going to make a long argument. In the end, there were 85 essays in support of the Constitution. And along the way, they fielded some of the objections that were going on by people like Brutus and others, loosely called the Anti-Federalists. And then when the Constitution was ratified by all the colonies, we had a federal government, the Constitution passed, and it might have even been before the complete ratification. I'd have to double check the dates, but all those essays were gathered together and published, in 1788 or something like that as the Federalist. So they're sort of considered the underlying political philosophy argument, at least by the winning side, so to speak. But if you read anything, including the Cambridge edition that I mentioned on the blog, anything about the Anti-Federalists, and I think even just reading the essays that we read, you see the way in which the resulting Constitution and the kind of arguments that have happened over time really embody them kind of jointly. contributing to the discussion. I mean, the Bill of Rights ends up getting included. It's one of the major objections by the Anti-Federalists is there was not an enunciation of specific civil liberties. And that became the Bill of Rights was one way of dealing with that, even though it came on the heels of the actual original ratification of the Constitution.
Which is funny because I thought somewhere in here I read that, not one of the ones we read, but that Hamilton argues specifically against the necessity of a Bill of Rights, that the way the government is set up already protects everybody. And yet Madison actually drafted the first drafted the Bill of Rights when it came down to it. So,
yeah, and there were people who were prominent, like Thomas Jefferson, I guess technically was a Federalist, but he had significant anti-Federalist leanings. Mm-hmm. Madison was a big proponent of the power of the legislature and also trying to tame it. Hamilton's a big proponent of the power of the executive and commerce. Mm-hmm. And you see both of those themes through and through.
Yeah. Have we explicitly said what a Federalist and an Anti-Federalist is? We
haven't said that. A Federalist was someone who was in favor of the adoption of the proposed Constitution that would generate a federal government that was, even though it was an assembly of states and the states had rights, the federal government would hold final power over it. So you had the establishment of the presidency and the House of Representatives and the Senate and the Supreme Court, and ways to make laws of the land and ways for the House of Representatives to raise money and tax, and also the building of a national army.
Mm-hmm. Right. They're supposed to each have powers in separate spheres so that we are all each simultaneously citizens of two different governmental entities.
Yes. Yes.
That neither one you could say is supreme over the other.
No, that's wrong. It's clear that the federal government trumps. It's even in the Constitution from the beginning.
Not in all areas.
No.
The federal government, for instance, can't tell the states, according to what I was seeing in these documents,
yes,
how to run their criminal justice system, for instance.
That's true, and that has persisted today. There's a whole separate court system for federal law versus state law. And, there are things that sort of seem weird, but that are a result of this. The individual state commerce, every state has its own insurance laws and its own ways of certifying a professional, like things like being a lawyer and having a bar and stuff like that. That's all done by states. I guess what I meant by saying that the federal government trumps is that with this document, there is one government with parts that have activities underneath it that have things separate from them, but it is much, much stronger of a unified arrangement than the Articles of Confederation ever were.
Mm-hmm. But it is useful to contrast this with, say, the British system, where the central national government could pretty much creates the entities under it for its own convenience of executing the law.
Yes.
So they could get rid of your local mayor or something, I guess, if it came to that, because they're ultimately appointing those people, whereas that's not the way it works here. That's the way that the relation between, say, states and counties, right? States create counties, even though county, you vote for your own local county board person, for instance, or even your local mayor. Those entities are for sure under state jurisdiction, whereas states are not under national jurisdiction in the same way.
They're not. And this exact point has been a source of great controversy throughout the history of the U.S., right? I mean, ignoring the Civil War, there's the whole civil rights era and the cases of the federal government saying that certain laws were being violated that were federal laws, even though the states had made them. I guess that's what I mean by state laws that the federal government trumps, is that there are spheres of work that the states have lots of latitude in, but it's not allowed that the states can have laws that are unconstitutional. They have got to. That's part of the deal, is that they abide by the Constitution.
Well, wasn't it an advance, say, that the states had to obey the Bill of Rights as well? I'm just reaching back to my U.S. history.
Well, I mean, once the Bill of Rights was part of the Constitution, then the states would have to follow that as well.
See, I thought that was actually a further amendment after that or something, that states had to.
there's an amendment in the Constitution, and we should be careful, right? We call them amendments to the Constitution, but they are the Constitution then, right?
Mm-hmm, sure.
There is one of them that says that the states retain all rights for themselves that are not enumerated explicitly in the Constitution.
It would be useful, or at least expedient, to kind of characterize what it means when we say that what we had was a loose confederation of states. Mm-hmm. The details are important in this case, where we had recently, won our independence from the realm and from the king, and there was the states had joined together under the Articles of Confederation.
Yes,
is that right?
Yep.
And so we were essentially kind of an alliance of independent states that were attempting to deal with a number of very important issues, both domestic and foreign, with respect to foreign policy, with respect to trade, with respect to interstate commerce. There were a lot of different things. And there was there was this sort of loose delineation between the states, north and south, one more focused on agriculture, one more focused on manufacture. And really what we have is a disagreement, or we have a debate about what's the right way for these states to come into confederation. And the Federalist Papers and federalism in general is a movement that's saying that a confederation of equal states that simply respect each other's authority is not sufficient for accomplishing what we need to accomplish in a union as a government. And then the anti-federalist position is no, states that are allied in this confederation can find a way to manage the business of running a country effectively. And so it's important to me anyway that we note that the entity of the state, or the fact that we have these 13 independent states, is very critical to this debate, not just in how the states come together under a federal system, but also with respect to what we're going to see about conversations around federalism versus nationalism and this idea of democracy versus a republic.
Yeah.
I just found on Wikipedia under Incorporation of the Bill of Rights, it's the process by which American courts have applied portions of the U.S. Bill of Rights to states. Prior to the 1890s, the Bill of Rights was held only to apply to the federal government.
Oh, that's what you're thinking of. I didn't understand.
Beginning in the 1920s, a series of Supreme Court decisions interpreted the 14th Amendment to incorporate most portions of the Bill of Rights, making these portions for the first time enforceable against the state governments. So really, other than distinguishing the state responsibilities from the national responsibilities, the federal responsibilities, there was no concern in this process of the Federalist Papers of protecting citizens from the states.
Yeah, we should be a little bit careful about this, because the understanding of the development of the Constitution and changes in the way we understand federal government evolved over time. And again, the biggest deal would be the prelude and then the outcome of the American Civil War, which is a kind of refounding in some important ways. And so we should just be careful not to gloss 200 years into exactly what is in this. And I think that's a good point, Mark, that the Bill of Rights here ends up being part of protecting people as members of the federal government, but not necessarily with respect to their states.
Mm-hmm. But clearly, the discussion of why a big state is better than a small state, in other words, why we should have the national government in the first place, has as one of its expressed purposes that in small states, it's easier for the minority to get oppressed, because the smaller number of people, they can more easily get together and make a majority, even of 51%, and come up with some evil plans to screw with the rest of the populace. Whereas in a larger group, according to Hamilton, I believe, it's just not going to be logistically feasible to do that. Certainly when I was reading these arguments through here, I was reflecting on, as one would naturally do at this point, how good the logic is given changes in transportation, communication, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And just things that they historically did not foresee. That, Certainly we won't have problems with factions in a larger state like that. It's the same argument I was just considering, that he just didn't think that majorities in a state as large as ours would really be a problem. Whereas I see that.
There are a lot of assumptions in here related both to the disposition of people as well as technology. That color. It's one of the things that's kind of a pet peeve of mine is when politicians and Supreme Court justices make decisions based on the technology of the day. As a point of reference, in one of the essays, I'm not quite sure which, Hamilton delineates the square mileage of the existing states and says, well, it's so many hundreds of miles wide by so many hundreds of miles long, and nothing, should prevent people from being able to get from even the farthest reaches of this to a central place in order to be able to do the representation that they need to do. So we shouldn't really worry about that. And he says, even if there's more states that are created, it should be okay. Clearly thinking of riding a horse and being no further west than the Mississippi.
Well, not even that far. The Appalachian Mountains.
Well, he actually says that the land, anyway, at the time is all the way to the Mississippi, even if there were no states at the time.
Sure.
But it's just one of those things where you say, like, okay, if you're going to stand on that argument, and it's probably expedient at the time, but from a philosophical point of view, hitching your horse to whatever happens to be possible at the time that you're riding is not always the best stance to take.
One thing that's interesting about these is that they're live editorials at the time, and they are intended explicitly to be persuasive. While there's clearly political philosophy going on, or at least an articulation of a particular political philosophy going on, it's not necessarily rumination, but an articulation of a particular point of view. They're proponents, and they have at sometimes even relatively explicit underpinnings of an interpretation of human nature and what the nature of good government is and what the relationship between liberty and good government ought to be and what the remedies are in a founding of a government for that.
Well, let me ask you a question then. If these were published in a popular format and they were intended to be persuasive to the relevant voting populace at the time, how should we or should we not interpret them as philosophical documents? Is it the same thing as saying, okay, well, let's take a look at this presidential debate, which was televised 4 days ago, and interpret that as a philosophical statement? Or is it, as it clearly was, intended to sway voters as opposed to state something based on, rigorous principles?
One of the reasons why you would expect that there would be more philosophical content to this kind of discussion, whether it happened to be, in 1787 or even today, is that it's at the beginning of something, right? They're constructing the government itself. So they're having to have these discussions about what the shape of the government ought to be and what the goal is and what the goal ought to be, and come up with some arguments for why it ought to be that way and all that stuff.
Yeah, that's our perspective from now. But I guess what I'm asking is, are we giving them too much credit? Do we defer too much to the vision and authority and principles of the founding fathers and lend too much credence to this? Could it possibly be that they're just engaging in the same kind of rhetoric that we see nowadays? We have the sense of that we now live in kind of a devolved era. The Washingtons and the Madisons and all that stuff were somehow different from us. I'm just curious.
I wasn't trying to make the founding fathers cast as giants among men argument. I wasn't trying to make that argument. I was saying that there is, I think, naturally going to be more philosophical disposition in this kind of discussion just because it's at the beginning of something.
Okay. That's fair.
It's also rhetorical in that a lot of this was responding to specific arguments that had been raised. And so it's really just trying to give all the possible responses to these. So I wouldn't expect a completely consistent and coherent set of responses because, think about if you're just, somebody has a position, you're just trying to think of all the ways to cut them down and why your position is better. I mean, that's not a recipe for a Leibnizian step-by-step philosophical treatise. That is more of a rhetorical creation. And certainly there are enough papers in here that I would expect things to be coming from some slightly different angles here and there It's arguing to an audience of revolutionaries, right? The Revolutionary War was 10 years before. These were all people that thought revolution was a legitimate reaction. So while you don't want to actually have, like in the Bill of Rights, a right to rebel, because that's sort of beside the point, you would be overthrowing the law. You don't need a law that says, okay, to overthrow the law. But as a rhetorical device, these people wanted to believe that, if things go badly, we'll be in a position to smash it all down. And I got to think, given what else Hamilton had to say, how concerned he was throughout these of having a stable government, that's not actually something that he wanted to happen. You know, he wanted a system that would control, even if a bad ruler was in power, would give us, legal means to get rid of them and not just make revolution easier.
Mm-hmm.
Well, given that, there's still some very coherent arguments in the ones we read. Do we want to just start going through, say, number 10?
That's a good one.
It's pretty short. Let's read some chunks of it. So if we just start at the second paragraph, he defines what he's talking about. By faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interests, averse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. Interest groups is what we would call them pretty much now. And he certainly had in mind class disputes, that he did not like the idea of all the laborers getting together and all the nobles getting together and fighting politically.
When he saw it as something that they had to protect against, because he expected that would happen.
He wants to keep the evil things that can result of this, which I think the evil things are just the government will be unstable, right? We don't want things to get to a point of revolution.
That's right. And we want it to flourish.
One of the things specifically cited is you don't want all the poor people getting together and taking the rich people's property and redistributing it, because the rich would react violently. It's not just that it's unjust or something like that. It's that this would make things horribly unstable.
There's something about that going on right away when in the next couple of paragraphs, he says, look, you can get rid of the causes of faction by destroying liberty, which is clearly not desirable. So we'll keep liberty, even though it's dangerous, because it's basically throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Nor can you give every citizen the same opinions, the same passions, and the same interests.
Right.
Yes. In there.
Yep.
I just want to make one point about this concept of a faction, Mark, that differentiates a little bit. It's not just about revolutionary factions. It's also about special interests. You don't necessarily have to be a revolution, but it could be, this comes up later on, manufacturing versus agriculture, or what he's saying is that we have this desire, we have this need to have a system in place where a group that has only their own self-interest and a very narrow self-interest at heart, that we can control that, whether they are the majority or the minority. And there's some issues around the majority a little later on. But on that same page, I'm going to read a little bit more. As long as the reason of man continues fallible, and he is at the liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed. As long as the connection subsists between his reason and his self-love, his opinions and his passions will have a reciprocal influence on each other, and the former will be objects to which the latter will attach themselves.
Finish that whole paragraph.
The diversity in the faculties of men, from which the rights of property originate, is not less an insuperable obstacle to a uniformity of interest. The protection of these faculties is the first object of government. I went ahead and did a little Socratic kind of syllogistic logic approach to this and tried to figure out, and it says, okay, reason is fallible, man is free to exercise it, self-love is connected to reason, and passion is connected to self-love. So passions will always drive reasons when men are free to exercise it at liberty. I think what he's trying to say is government should have the function to check the power of, let's call it, reason-strengthened self-interest exercised through liberty.
You say government should check that, but in this case, that's government with a small g. That is, the very structure of the government ought to be made such that that is checked. It's not that you have government with a big G who's going to come in and break up the bullies and the different factions on the field. It's that the structure of the way in which the government itself operates will be a throttle on that.
Absolutely. If it was the first method, it would be that curing by removing the cause.
Yes.
We don't want government to make everybody think the same thing and put fluorides in the water or whatever it is to control our thought processes.
Is that what that does?
I don't know. I'm not a scientist. But it's rather that the structure of government should be such that factions cannot exercise their power to gain control of the government and overthrow it. And how that's actually going to work is a whole other question.
Yeah, so it's acknowledging that people will knowingly and rightly, because they're guided by self-love, either individuals or as groups, try to do what's in their self-interest. And essentially saying that's okay.
Yeah.
But we need to have a situation in which no one of them sort of goes hog wild. Otherwise, that's going to cause problems in general. It will be against liberty.
Yes.
Right. So the whole thing has a very Hobbesian deterministic take. I don't know. I was noticing in some of the Hamilton stuff I was reading here that it's very much we need to put levers and pulleys in place so that people's motivations will be manipulated so that they will not take excessive power. Right. That's what the checks means, that there's punishments in place. I mean, that's the way you'd operate criminal law. You know, how severe a punishment do you have to have looming out there to curb the behavior that you want to curb?
The argument here is that human beings are going to act out of self-interest, and that's okay. And that a large group of human beings who have a diversity of self-interests can still come together in a ordered political system and function. I suspect that one of the arguments against federating the colonies originally was that there was such a diversity of people, such a diversity of languages and of religions and of socioeconomic motivations that you couldn't possibly bring such a diverse group together and expect them to be able to function in a governmental structure that derived its power from the people. One of the arguments that they're going to make later on is that that's true if you're talking about a democracy, but not about a representative democracy. And the anti-federalists are going to say, no, it's true whether you're talking about a representative democracy or democracy. But it was critical for the advocates for federalism to identify or at least acknowledge, you know, it's like saying, hey, we understand that this is a vast and diverse nation. And that we understand that people have it's rational self-interest, right, on the economic model. And that is a challenge, but not an impediment to forming a government that is for the people, by the people.
Well, in fact, Hamilton would make the positive argument that it's actually better. That the size and extension of the new republic is actually an advantage.
This relates back to what you were saying before about does federal trump state, that even though technically, you know, there were mechanisms that it seemed like the federal government could reach out its long arms and mess with, say, state administration of their police force or really any sort of internal administration things. Hamilton says specifically, people are ambitious. The things that they're going to want to do if they're put in the federal government is not to busy themselves with tedious administrative things on the state level. That's looking at the self-interested motivation or whatever of the leaders of the federal government. This is what is going to prevent the government from taking too much power. It's going to be basically too boring to want to encroach on those state powers, which I thought was hilarious, given the way things have gone. Think about people following their self-interest or their ambition, or however you want to put it, as water flowing down. And so you're trying to create a series of dams to keep the water from flowing down. And like, oh, well, it might go down in this spot. Well, then we'll do some extra shoring up there. But you could set up a structure that puts all the dams in place, but then the water is still going to then adjust. It will keep wanting to flow down and it will create new rivulets in the dirt or something. And so you would expect then to have to not just say, what did the originators specifically picture as the mechanisms which we might use to limit, say, federal power, but we would want to look at their overall intention, which is this limitation. instead of just going with the original intentions, we need to revisit the situation, every 5 or 10 years, frankly, and say, okay, we thought we had prevented factionalism with this system we set up, but look, there were super factions formed by different factions coming together to form massive political parties that are doing just as much damage as the factions we originally wanted to avoid. It might not just be just the laborers, but now the laborers have joined up with the intelligentsia, or the farmers have joined up with the industrialists, and they are creating trouble. And so now we need to adjust things.
Do you really think that those kinds of adjustments would be ones that would go to the fundamental structure I'm not sure that they would agree with that. In fact, the last couple papers that we read go towards this question of Madison's argument against referendum and against sequential reevaluations of the Constitution. Both those things in particular he addresses, which seem to be the things that you're talking about. And he says that it basically is too chaotic, so it's against stability, and unnecessary if we found it right, so that there are mechanisms for changing the structure of government and revising the Constitution, and that those are there so you can get a new Constitution by changing it through that mechanism, so it's a live document, and that the rest of it can be worked out. Not that it's going to be prescriptive, but that their goal, at least, is a structure that will then become embodied in presumably different ways.
Whether you're actually changing the Constitution or just doing it through other means, I'm not committing to that yet, but it could be the case that some of the calculations as to how things would work out are proven wrong over time.
Well, the perfect example is the 3/5 man, right? Brutus brings this up. When you read the Constitution, the original form of it, there's this bizarre calculation of how you decide how many representatives are going to be in each state, in which you go through and count slaves as 3/5 persons. And it's clearly a kludge to make sure that you get all 13 colonies, including the southern colonies, in on the document. You could argue that not resolving that at the Constitution in 1787 is what gets resolved in the Civil War.
I mean, I wasn't referring just to the actual numerical calculations. I'm talking about, in this Federalist paper, we get an argument that factions are a problem. There's always going to be factions just because of human nature. But here's a system which is basically having a large state that is going to prevent the damage that factions could bring about. But I think that calculation has clearly been proven wrong.
Do you think that's the whole content of the argument, is that the way factions are going to be addressed is we're just going to make the state big enough to deal with that? I read it as being more trying to calm fears about the idea of the republic being too big, and saying, well, yeah, I think it'll be actually an advantage. But not that it was somehow a fundamental political or philosophical underpinning of the way of dealing with factions.
Well, let's focus on what the problem is that they're trying to solve here, right? Or at least the argument he's trying to make. What he's saying is there are factions. We acknowledge that factions will always exist and that factions are motivated or driven by the self-interests of the people that make them up. We can't make people all have the same self-interest or ignore that interest, so we have to control the effects. Well, the first thing is, if you're talking about a faction that's a minority underneath a republican system, I don't know if at this point he's making the argument that the republican system is somehow different or better than democracy and that democracy is subject to this.
You're talking to number 10?
Still in number 10. Okay.
This is Madison, and the whole thing is an argument in part that a Republican government with representatives is going to be better than democracy, which would have the tyranny of majority problem.
Absolutely.
If a faction consists of less than a majority, relief is supplied by the Republican principle, which enables the majority to defeat its sinister views, interesting language, by regular vote. It may clog the administration, it may convulse the society, but it will be unable to execute and mask its violence under the forms of the Constitution. When a majority is included in a faction, the form of popular government, on the other hand, enables it to sacrifice to its ruling passion or interest both the public good and the rights of the other citizen. To secure the public good and private rights against the danger of such a faction, and at the same time preserve the spirit and the form of popular government, is then the great object to which our inquiries are directed.
Yeah. In other words, it's going to be hard.
Yes.
The net of this is what we used to call, or what we learned, I'm assuming you guys learned the same thing, the tyranny of the majority. as opposed to the tyranny of the minority. And like I said, I'm not sure if at this point he's making the subtle distinction between republicanism and democracy, but he's basically saying, what do we do when there's a majority of people who have a self-interest, but why is that self-interest damaging? Why is it harmful?
It's only if it's a passion that takes it over, a pernicious passion that is not going to be to everyone else's benefit. You know, let's get rid of all the religions that are different than ours. Okay,
suppose the majority are Protestant, which was at the time, I think, true, right? Or Anglicans. So if the Protestants got up and decided, you know what, we decided we want to make America a Protestant land and we're going to outlaw all of the religions. That's an example of the pernicious, violent majority faction.
Can I read the next paragraph here?
Mm-hmm.
By what means is this object attainable? Evidently by one of two only. Either the existence of the same passion or interest in a majority at the same time must be prevented, or the majority, having such coexistent passion or interest, must be rendered by their number and local situation unable to concert and carry into effect schemes of oppression. If the impulse and the opportunity be suffered to coincide, we well know that neither moral nor religious motives can be relied on as adequate control. They are not found to be such on the injustice and violence of individuals, and lose their efficacy in proportion to the number combined together, that is, in proportion as their efficacy becomes needful. In other words, you can't rely on people's good nature to prevent them from doing horrible things. Again, either the existence of the same passion or interest in a majority at the same time must be prevented, which I'm not sure how that could even be done.
It can't.
You can't. Okay.
That's the causes argument.
Or the majority, having such coexistent passion or interest, must be rendered by their number and local situation unable to concert and carry into effect schemes of oppression. That says to me what I was just saying, which is it's the fact that we're going to have such a big state is going to prevent this, that people in Tennessee might want to be assholes toward their slaves, but we're going to have a national government that is going to prevent that kind of pernicious action by what will then become a minority, because it won't be the majority. If there was a majority sentiment in the whole country, they would be so out of touch with each other. There's no way that they could get together and make the sort of harm that they would in a state.
It's certainly the case that in Federalist 10, and if you keep going, he makes an argument about large republics being best, and at the end saying essentially that having a large republic means greater diffusion of faction and you have more tempering of these things. He certainly includes that argument in there. But I guess I would really argue that you need to consider this along with, at the very least, 51 and the presentation of the separation of powers, in which he addresses these kinds of things as well. It's just clear to me that it's more than just bigger is better, and that means that we have less faction.
That's interesting, because my reading of this, Dylan, was that this is the argument against a pure democracy and in favor of a republic of the sort that gets enumerated later, where you have proportional representation to population and you have equal representation with respect to the statehood. If you have just a straight democracy, you can have a majority that have the special interest. But there's this underlying assumption that states represent, let's call them clusters of self-interest, and that as long as there is a voting mechanism that gives equal representation to each state, aka the Senate, you have a safeguard against a tyranny of the majority from a purely populist or a purely democratic point of view.
In my edition, it's just on the next page, he explicitly goes on to contrast pure democracy and a republic. And he says, hence it is that such democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. Theoretic politicians who have patronized this species of government have erroneously supposed that by reducing mankind to a perfect equality in their political rights, they would at the same time be perfectly equalized and assimilated in their possessions, their opinions, and their passions. And then he goes on, he says, a republic, by which I mean a government in which the scheme of representation takes place, opens a different prospect and promises the cure for which we are seeking.
All of what you just said, I have highlighted with notes because it seemed to me to be really, really critical. I think Madison's point here is that if you give everybody equal rights and if you give everybody liberty, you aren't guaranteeing security of the union or security of the state.
Or security of the individuals.
Or even security of the individuals, but specifically here talking about how would you construct a government? Because people don't reason from pure motives, they reason from self-interest, rational self-interest, right? And it appears as though the great intellectual father of both the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist position here in number 10 was Montesquieu in The Spirit of the Laws. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to drop names, sorry. But Montesquieu was a French political theorist, amongst other things, who was heavily influenced by Locke. And he defined basically three different kinds of political systems: republican, monarchical, and despotic. That should sound familiar to anybody who listened to our Aristotle episode, by the way. Montesquieu said that each one of these political systems was driven or motivated by a particular principle. And the principle was kind of the spring or motor that motivated the citizens to behave the way they did. And he said, for democratic republics, the motivating principle is the love of virtue, which is the willingness to put interests of the community ahead of private interests. So let's take this back to what we were just talking about. We have a positing of human beings as rationally self-interested. And then we have this political theory, which says that it's necessary for human beings to actually be rationally not self-interested. They have to be rationally other-interested, or at least interested in the common good, which is not necessarily their self-interest. And I think it's interesting that you have both the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist here appealing to the same philosophical progenitor or father in Montesquieu, and yet the principle that he claims motivates Republican democracy seems contradictory with this state of nature-esque view of human beings that's already been put forth in the same essay.
Montesquieu wasn't a Hobbesian, is sort of what you're saying.
Montesquieu may have been a Hobbesian, but what Montesquieu said was that Republican democracies require that there be a love of virtue, that there be this ability to overcome your self-interest. At the individual level, you're able to put aside your self-interest and appeal and understand and work towards the common good. And yet, everything we talked about up until now is about how the individual self-interest is what motivates people, and we're trying to create a governmental structure, which, by the way, is a Republican democracy, which is somehow supposed to contain that rational self-interest and neuter it, or at least put mechanisms in place that can control it.
Maybe this is the difference between the French Enlightenment. This is to call back to our Voltaire episode. That Montesquieu is like the Leibnizians in France who were optimists about these things, as opposed to the more Protestant, all men are sinners, Hobbesian kind of thing.
You make me think of the stuff that we read by Brutus.
Oh, yeah.
So Brutus seems to be a little bit more in that camp of saying, look, we need a smaller republic because we need to have representatives that are actually like the people. And in this proposed constitution, you don't get anything like representatives, that they do not reflect the makeup of the population at all. They can't possibly, because there's just too few of them. And you need to have people who know their neighbors, who go out to lunch with people, who buy things from the guy up the street. You need to have a small republic in order for that to work, because you need to have people in love with the common good. And you get that by having people interact with one another. And he strongly objects to the size of the republic as being not Republican. Mm-hmm. And what you were just saying makes me think that that's where he's coming from. It's a different point of view about what ought to motivate the founding of the republic. And it seems to me that Madison and Hamilton, the Federalists, would simply say they're being sanguine about it. Yeah, it's great. People should have that kind of fellow feeling. But at the end of the day, it's not going to sustain things. And you don't want to include in this structure the ability for people just to say, let's just agree to disagree and move on. They want it to be tighter than that. One of Madison's most famous quotes is, if all men were angels, no government would be necessary.
Well, I thought Seth was asking there, looked like a seeming paradox to me, is that these guys are coming up and, in fact, then trying to persuade their audience with a system that is for the common good. Yet it assumes that all the individuals in it are not acting toward the common good, but acting toward a narrow self-interest, and how that seems to be a contradiction. And being committed to this Hobbesian take on people and therefore on the social structures that you build around them as being people are sort of determined and they're going to do what they're going to do, and they're not freely choosing the good all the time or anything like that. Treating people like machines like that, which is basically what the Hobbesian dealy is about, which I think Locke took up as well, is not quite the same as saying they're all evil, that they all have this narrow self-interest. Aristotle's position himself is very mechanistic in this way. You know, we have a human nature, we pursue certain things, but we don't pursue this narrow version of self. Remember, we argued Aristotle thought that the self is only fulfilled when it is in society. And correspondingly, that only in a good society can the self be healthy and get itself together and not be sort of corrupted. And the narrow self-interest, the selfishness, would be a corruption of human nature. Whereas humans, if properly fed and cared for, so to speak, socially included, are not going to be quite so nasty. So when you're building the pieces of society, yes, you can't assume that everybody's going to be angels, but that doesn't mean that we're assuming that everybody's devils or that it rules out even our actions in trying to ratify this constitution that will bring about the common good. No, we can have good motives. That's just fine. Lots of people can have good motives. It's sort of in our extended self-interest to be in a good society and to have the common good and to, like the examples you were giving, to engage economically with the people around us in a jovial manner.
Yeah, so I guess Madison and Hamilton and the Federalists seem bent on not requiring that everybody have the common good in mind in order to have a good government. Mm-hmm. In order to have the government work, they do not want to have one of the fundamental pieces that everybody have the common good in mind.
But it does seem like at least some of the people have to have the common good in mind, because these safeguards are not, it's just about making the problems less likely. Yes. So this whole thing with factions, it's not only having a big state, and the rest of the examples that he gave in that number 10, let me just read one more quote from the end of that. The influence of factious leaders may kindle a flame within their particular states, but will be unable to spread a general conflagration throughout the other states. A religious sect may degenerate into a political faction in a part of the Confederacy, but the variety of sects dispersed over the whole entire face of it must secure the national councils against any danger from that source. And then he gives some examples. A rage for paper money, that's one of the evils. For an abolition of debts, for an equal division of property, or for any other improper or wicked project will be less apt to pervade the whole body of the Union than a particular member of it, in the same proportion as such a malady is more likely to taint a particular county or district than an entire state.
Yes.
Yeah, he's giving the example geographically, but certainly it goes just as well with separation of powers. To have both houses of Congress that get in there in different ways, and the executive and the judicial branch infected with the same, we're going to kill all non-Protestants sentiment, or whatever the horrible tyranny of the majority example you want to come up with, is less likely. But still, it's not impossible, right?
And they would admit that, right? But looking at it some more while we're talking, it's clear that they really emphasize those large republic as being one piece of this kind of distance. They want to have distance between the parts and not have them have to interact with each other too much so as they have a conflagration, right? They want to have enough friction without having the whole engine bind up.
Right.
Yeah. There's actually a section right before that, which I think articulates the main point of view better, and which I think is patently false, just FYI. Hence, it clearly appears that the same advantage which a republic has over a democracy in controlling the effects of faction. Again, going back to the point I made earlier, that the argument here is that if you have some kind of system where you're not a pure democracy, where you're not one person, one vote, but that you have some kind of balanced representative democracy, in controlling the effects of faction is enjoyed by a large over a small republic, is enjoyed by the union over the states composing it. Does the advantage consist in the substitution of representatives whose enlightened views and virtuous sentiments render them superior to local prejudice and the schemes of injustice? It will not be denied that the representation of the Union will most likely possess these requisite endowments.
But you have to finish it because at the end, he doesn't want to agree with that. That's required, right?
No, he says here again, the extent of the Union gives its most palpable advantage. What he's trying to say is that representation or representative democracy has a virtue over straight democracy, one man, one vote, with respect to creating a structure that controls the pernicious effects of factions. And insofar as representative democracy is better than what we might call pure or Greek, sort of like polis democracy, the extent is expanded insofar as you have a larger republic versus a smaller one.
It's very easy for me to read that and snicker about, look at the quality of the representatives. Certainly that is not actually the way it's turned out. This was a bad calculation. But then I sit back and think about what criteria people generally use to vote. I would think it would be only in rare cases where people actually don't vote for somebody that they think would do a better job than they would. Do you not at least see that? You could criticize people's ability to judge competence, but I think it's almost impossible for the person that's elected not to be, say, more intelligent and virtuous than the median voter.
Oh, I don't know about that.
You don't think that is the case?
No, I don't. But I don't even think that's their concern here. There is that part there where they talk about virtuousness and this enlightened point of view that the representatives are supposed to have. But what they're driving at is the mere mechanism of representation versus straight democracy is supposed to somehow mitigate the influence of factions, which is to say, mitigate the influence of self-interest. So somehow, by creating a structure where you don't have everybody in a district or a town or a state voting at the national level, that instead they have to elect a representative, that representative is somehow going to have to take into account all the multitude of points of view in whatever district or region that they represent. And they're going to have to do it in such a way where they balance out the interests of the various groups, that is somehow going to be a check against the influence of factions. And I think that's just a fatal flaw. To assume that somebody who gets elected into office is going to say, okay, it's my job to represent all of the interests of everybody in my district, when in fact they are going to represent the interest of the people who are responsible for getting them elected, just seems wishful thinking.
Sure. Well, this is one of the arguments that Brutus makes, right?
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
That essentially it's not representative enough. There are too few of them, and it's impossible. In fact, I think Brutus essentially acknowledges that, look, people are going to be representative of a much smaller swath of society, the part that they come from. And in order to have those voices in government, we need to have a much wider swath of representatives in government.
Mm-hmm.
Let me read a quote from Brutus 3. This is the third to last full paragraph. The very term representative implies that the person or body chosen for this purpose should resemble those who appoint them. A representation of the people of America, if it be a true one, must be like the people. It ought to be so constituted that a person who is a stranger to the country might be able to form a just idea of their character by knowing that of their representatives. They are the sign. The people are the things signified. I love that.
I remember that. I thought that was a great, yeah.
Then skipping down a little bit. The House of Assembly, which is intended as a representation of the people of America, will not or cannot, in the nature of things, be a proper one. 65 men cannot be found in the United States, hold the sentiments, possess the feelings, or acquainted with the wants and interests of this vast country. This extensive continent is made up of a number of different classes of people, and to have a representation of them, each class ought to have an opportunity of choosing their best informed men for the purpose. But this cannot possibly be the case in small number. Skipping a little, so talking about just New York in particular, the fact that they'll only have 6 members of the assembly as it was thought at that time. In this assembly, the farmer, merchant, mechanic, and other various orders of people ought to be represented according to their respective weight and numbers. And the representatives ought to be intimately acquainted with the wants, understand the interests of the several orders of their society, and feel a proper sense and becoming zeal to promote their prosperity. Right. So, of course, not going to happen if there's only 6 representatives. He says, according to the course of human affairs, the natural aristocracy of the course will be elected. Wealth always creates influence, and this is generally much increased by family connections, etc. So
he's just right. Yeah.
Yes. Damn.
Yeah. So he's just exactly right.
In that last point, that is correct. However, it seems like Madison and Hamilton don't want to have 3 people in the House of Representatives that represent the labor unions and 3 people that represent the traders, and to go down that list. This is the kind of factionalism that they are against. Somehow we want to get people that have a balanced take on what is the good of the community and will not just like, I'm always going to vote with my interest group. And that's just the way it's going to be.
The idea is that the structure of representation is going to accomplish what you're asking for. And I think what we're seeing and what we're saying and what history has shown is that that's not the case.
So that's a calculation made by the authors of the Federalist Papers, the authors of the Constitution, that has gone wrong.
Well, let's tease this out a little bit. Part that seems to be absolutely clear is that the predominance of representatives in the House and in the Senate are most often, though not always, essentially people of a certain class, certainly wealthy and often connected. Now, it's very often the case in the Senate. It's not always the case in the House of Representatives, and there's lots of examples of congressmen who are farmers or were farmers and normal people. But the way in which it's representative certainly requires a notion of trying to take into account the ideas of their constituents and not operating from a standpoint of just self-interest.
That's exactly the problem. The philosophical pretension of the Federalist is that representation somehow controls or checks or defeats self-interest. And yet at the same time, earlier on in the essay, it says something like, there's a reason why we don't allow an individual man to be his own judge, because there's no way you could possibly be neutral in that. So why do we assume that a group of people who have the same self-interest should be competent to judge their own matters, right? And I think that's really what this comes down to. This is how I framed it for myself. The argument here is that representation, or the Republican form of government, which is to say a representative democracy, somehow stands as a natural check to unrestrained self-interest of the faction. And it just strikes me that that is just not true.
You would say you just have to add in something else in order to have that restraint.
I guess.
Yeah, that you have to have some notion of public good that is inculcated and part of the political disposition of most of those representatives.
Absolutely.
And that's an added thing, that it's not the case that they all come there operating in terms of self-interest and then everything works out because of the structure. You have some of that structure going on that helps, but you really require that people who are members of that government have a notion of public good in mind.
Yes. It's essentially saying that the structure itself may or may not be the right one. It may or may not be good, but whatever it is, it doesn't do the work that they're claiming it does.
Okay, we're an hour in. Let's take a break for a not school update. I'm thinking most of you heard in our last episode what it is to be a PEL citizen. That is, you set up a $5 recurring donation and you get access to some bonus content and also get to participate in ongoing discussion groups. First, you should know that we've added to the store of bonus content a recording of me reciting the whole of one of the Quine essays that we'll be talking about next time. We'd like to do more readings like that, but can only do so if we get enough subscribers to warrant the time. Second, regarding not school study groups. So far the concept is working. As of the last week in October, we've got about 100 PEL citizens, which is more than enough for several active study groups. In October, we had ones talking about philosophy movies and pragmatism, and for November, we've got some groups continuing or starting up on the Federalist Papers, on Quine, our next topic, on Deleuze, Thomas Nagel, Harry Frankfurt, David Chalmers, some philosophical novels, and more movies. Another group has been proposed specifically for philosophy newbies to read some short bits of Plato, Locke, and Bertrand Russell. There's still time to propose and form additional groups, so seriously, go sign up today via the sidebar ad at partiallyexaminedlife.com. Thanks. So this is my way of thematically unifying this discussion in my head, is when you're thinking about the intentions of the founders, for the most part, I'm not thinking about how can I be more American and just read whatever view I already have into the intention of the founders, and so I can say I'm more American. I would rather read this like a philosophy text and see what the good ideas are in here, and if they're not so good, and obviously it's very relevant because these are the foundation of our legal system, more or less. Again, maybe not every single argument made its way into the actual practice, but enough of it. Then I want to know what could be the justification. This is sort of what we have to argue against if we want to change something. And I do believe in a progressive society. So the two ways that I could see challenging the things we're reading in here are if their calculations are wrong. So this thing about representatives, it seems that was just wrong in the first place. The thing that I mentioned about the federal government, it would just be too tedious of them to want to take over administration of internal state matters. Like that's just, no, that has not worked out that way. The federal government really has no limits in the interests that individuals can find for extending its influence into state matters. And if that's something that we care about, then we would have to make more direct measures than just saying that we don't expect that this would be a concern. Even at the time, some of the things that they were arguing for, the Bill of Rights is a result of people saying, well, no, we're not going to leave that to your calculations. We're going to actually put some language in it, not just that it's not in the federal government's interest to suppress religion. We want to actually spell that out, even though Hamilton may think that that's just redundant of what's already in the Constitution. This is something that's been right on the table since the beginning, is that the fact that some of these calculations could be wrong. So there's that. And then there's also, just putting aside whether the calculations are correct or not, concerns can just change. That these folks were concerned about kingship and the abuse of power by kingship. And as you were saying, the abuse of power by legislators, the tyranny of the majority. They weren't concerned about the actions of the states, we were saying, that came later. They also weren't concerned, seemingly, about the power of large-scale corporations and things like that. Maybe because they thought about power as largely a matter of military power, ultimately a matter of military power. That's why you'd want to keep your citizenry armed and able to put together an insurrection against the unlawful government if it ever gets out of control, is because they weren't thinking like Foucault thinks about power, to drop a name. Go listen to the episode about that, who really saw there's so many ways we exert power that have nothing to do with the legal system. And in fact, most of the ways we assert power have nothing to do with the legal system. And maybe there are lots of really awful abuses that, say, go on in the typical husband-wife relationship in the time, or the typical even parent-child relationship, or especially the employer-employee.
You don't even have to get that abstract. We have a structure of power in slavery that's already extant and very viscerally present to them. So it's not like they weren't aware of the movement and structure and concept of power, as Foucault would have understood it.
But that was more directly protected by law because of the slave owners making a big complaint about it. Maybe it wasn't such an issue of, I don't know what the history of labor relations was back then, whether the employers felt they needed to be protected from their employees. Certainly they were protected by law. The employees couldn't just steal the goods that they were creating and stuff like that. But I'm not sure to what extent what you're saying about slavery, Seth, was sort of recognized in the spheres that we would be concerned about it today and in the more recent history.
Well, actually, I saw a link today to an article sort of reevaluating Thomas Jefferson. The gist of the article was, Jefferson was in the 1780s a pretty vocal advocate. I don't want to say he was anti-slavery because that's not the right way to characterize it, but he, was a very vocal, equal rights of man kind of person. And then by the 1790s had retreated from that, and his behavior was not consistent with his professed point of view. And that there were contemporaries even at the time who made note of that. And so my point is just that you're talking about that their concern was about power, and that they didn't understand corporate power. Maybe they were just thinking about sovereign power, but not even taking into account man over woman, or husband over wife, or parents over children. And what I'm saying is there was a very explicit power dynamic in the slave system that was obvious to everybody and was quite acknowledged and present to everyone, that they couldn't possibly have been ignoring.
Well, Brutus brings this up, right? He's explicit about it being, from his point of view, an abomination that part is in the Constitution.
Absolutely, and rightly so.
As Mark was saying, ascertaining, looking through the Federalist and teasing out how those arguments work or don't work and what kind of extrapolations are being made. I think that's a little bit different than trying to make some kind of judgment about, broadly speaking, the Founding Fathers. I think it's hard not to consider the Anti-Federalists as part of the Founding Fathers. Even if though the pictures of Jefferson and Madison and Hamilton get laid up on the walls, it's clear, you're just reading the little bit that we read from Brutus, that the disagreements and many of the tensions that we see today are present right from the beginning in the structure of government, the relationship of the states, what different kinds of powers there are. It's an interesting question to me about the role of technology and their failure to predict the massive urbanization of it. I mean, I don't know if you should have necessarily expected it, but a related question would be is whether or not the Constitution, as it was formed, is genuinely up to the task of acclimating and adjusting to that changing environment. What some people argue is that it's a live document that can adjust to that, either by different interpretations of the exact same words or by changes in itself or not. The Constitution progressively gets much more democratic over time. There's more direct representation, more direct election than ever was included in the Constitution in 1787.
Yeah, in fact, maybe I should add a third sort of reason for a change. It's not just that the concerns could change, but that it's not quite the same thing to say that the facts on the ground can change, right? That's clearly one of the things that they were concerned with is, why representatives are going to be superior to the people they represent. They're going to be more wise and virtuous is because of the paltry state of education, for instance. So the fact that these things were appearing in a popular newspaper, but that doesn't mean that they were aimed at the masses. That means that they were aimed at sort of an educated elite that would be reading these newspapers. So of course they would be okay with some aristocratic elements that we just wouldn't see the need for anymore. That whatever your opinion of the masses and their lack of education now, it is not comparable to what things were back there. So things have changed on the ground, and you could keep the same principles that we want to have our elected officials be wiser than the average, but yet not think that we have to take such draconian measures now to make that happen. That's different than added concerns, and that's different from the original calculations being wrong.
What we were talking about earlier in 10 was what seems to be a mistake in the extrapolation regarding the way faction regulates itself. I think there's even some tension between 10 and 51 on this point, in terms of separation of powers, at least, which is a little bit different than factions. I mean, this is sort of within the government itself, that ambition must be made to counteract ambition and stuff like that. They seem to be missing the notion that part of the success of this government is going to be that, on balance, there are people that believe in the notion of the public good. That's part of the discussion. It's not going to be possible for the government to work through a simply adversarial point of view. If you had the government set up the way a court of law is set up here, where each side is supposed to jealously argue for its own point of view, and the idea is that justice will come out of that. So there is no deliberation by anyone but the jury at some level. Partisans there are supposed to make whatever argument is possible to be made that's also legal in defense of their point of view. There's some hints of that going on, of that kind of let it fight out and it'll work out. But I think Seth was saying that it clearly can't happen that way. Even amongst the advocates of either side, that there has to be some notion of common good. Otherwise, it starts grinding to a halt and not working very well. And
they like the fact that there was diversity, which would make it harder for, again, factions to come about. But they also like the fact that there was a lot of commonality in the ethnicity, in the language, etc., that they thought was pretty much necessary to have things actually move forward.
People make that argument about efforts to proselytize democracy around the world, is that the circumstances of democracy are really important, and that the circumstances of the American founding were unusual and that other countries have circumstances that make it possible to have more democratic forms of rule. And the reason why in some parts of the world where there's a kind of attempt at doing democracy sort of foisted upon these countries is that they're just not ready for it. Or, I mean, that would be a notion that of certain kind of presumption about evolving forms of government. But it's just the facts on the ground aren't such that it's going to work. And one of those things has to do with the notion of the common good.
It just seems, though, that one of the things that we've learned over time is that we've evolved a system to deal. Okay, you can have a notion of a common good by, say, bringing up the harm principle. We can agree on what constitutes a harm in most cases, and we have these other things spelled out. So even if I don't think it's a harm to squash your religion or squash your speech or something like that, well, nope, it says in the Bill of Rights that we can't do that anyway. So we don't just leave it to the harm principle. We have these other things built in. That's a very minimum standard, and we can have quite a diverse, set of interests and ethnic backgrounds and languages, et cetera, and that all still works. Like, that's something we've developed. And so it seems like that argument saying that that wouldn't work for some other country because there's too much division among their people or something, like, no, we've already worked past that. Does not seem persuasive.
Well, I was just thinking about Seth's comment about the faction is that one of the reasons why you see democracy failing in other countries is a presence of faction in which there is no notion of them being in it together. And so you just have the factions fighting it out. That sounds a lot like what we read in 10, that it's just a result of the interactions of the factions that it'll work out. Though maybe based upon what we read, that Madison would say, look, if it's just too small, if it's the size of Rhode Island and you have factions, it's not going to work. You need to have a way to spread out, have enough factions that no one of them rises to the top and causes great unrest, and enough space in order for that to happen.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting that you mentioned the different countries, Dylan. I lived in Europe for a couple of years when I was in grad school, and I saw some of these other political systems kind of up close and personal. One of the typical complaints about the United States is that we're a two-party system, which you see echoed here already, right? You were talking about things being present at the founding of the country. The fact that we have these, I would call them bipolar views, right? So Federalist, anti-Federalist state versus federal. I used to say, God, I wish we were more like some of these European countries where there were more than one party.
A parliamentary system or something like that.
Yes.
Yeah, more than two parties. On the one hand, there are the countries where the party has to get a minimum of X% of vote in order to get any representation in government. And then there's countries where there's 30 parties, right? There's every single special interest party you can possibly imagine. If you get enough votes from whatever little district you're in, then you're there in government. And all of them are representative democracies.
Mm-hmm.
They're certainly not straight democracies in the sense of every individual person having representation at the National Assembly. It's you elect somebody to go and represent you. So if you look at Italy, France, Denmark, Germany, Holland, any of these places, they're all representative democracies. It's just a question of degree to which there is a state or a state versus the federal level that's being represented. And is it clear that any of them work any better than the rest? I used to think so. I used to think it would be better if you had explicit special interest parties that represented big themes like Greens. You had the Labour Party, the Green Party.
Mm-hmm.
What constitutes better?
Excellent question.
Well, I usually think of it in terms of the ability to evolve, which our current system makes it very difficult. It's hard to even evaluate. In one of those parliamentary systems, you still have to have a coalition to vote together.
Yes.
To get something to happen. So what's the difference between having that and having something that happens in the primary level, say, in our parties? And it does seem like it is more effective to have the Green actually in the legislature than just have to say, please, Democrats, drift over to my side. But on the other hand, the right wing has been very successful, the far right, in shifting their party. So I can't blanket say that the small groups don't have effectiveness. It seems like a matter of what the nature and political character of the small group is.
In my mind, it would be better to have a true coalition, because you can imagine different kinds of ways that, say, if the Tea Party had to work with the Greens to get a majority in order to create a government, that somehow that would require people to work together in a way that's different than just having the two-party system where it's all about jockeying for position. And if you have the majority, you can do something. And if you don't, you don't.
Yeah, just the fact that you could have coalitions come together for particular issues, like the far righties and some far lefties could get together and vote against the wars instead of having to just toe the line.
And that they would have to do that as part of explicit political debate in which organizations make agreements with one another. And that's one of the interesting things about a parliamentary system is that parties, they have to go through an explicit negotiation to come together. And there are rules regarding how they dissolve the government and rules regarding how many you have to get together in order to form a government. And so there's a behavior, they call it forming a government in Britain and in Israel and other places that have parliamentary systems. Is after an election, then they form a government. And we tend to think that the prime minister got elected, but that's not actually true.
Right.
The prime minister is the head of his or her party. And then that when that party takes over, they're the presumptive prime minister. They're voted on by their party or their coalition. But sometimes there's jockeying for position for that even within those parties. So
it just seems like it was the specific circumstances of America at this time that people had much more loyalty and the power already rested in regions rather than in class interests or something like that. Whereas a European state that's been around for so long, they've had plenty of times to get all the labor rights across the country organized or whatever. But at this point, in this government, it was all a matter of like, how do we make Connecticut happy and Virginia happy? Not how do we make these different elements within them happy? And, we think of this experiment of the Constitution as sort of, we started from scratch and thought, what would be the ideal form of government? And we came up with this thing. But no, it was actually, this is something that we have to sell to this existing group of power structures, the states. And so this is what we came up with.
You make me think that this double structure of the federal government with the states and the importance of it being a revision of the articles, even if it is a throwing out of them, but it's really a way of bringing these states together, which is different than the case of the parliamentary systems, because those really go all the way down to individual people from the beginning, that they're not federal governments in the sense that they're not joinings of parts in order to form a government that regulates their intercourse. They might be representative or republics in a similar way to the United States, but this distinction between federal and state just doesn't seem to exist in the same way.
Right. Well, and that's another thing that if we're looking at how we might want to change things now. I mean, separation of powers is a good idea. So having some distinction between not only the branches within the federal government, but federal and state that seems a good idea to me, without committing to any particular things that I think the state should retain. But a lot of the original motivation for having the states have as much power as they did, I think, has gone with the change in our culture. At least outside of Texas, we are probably not such regional chauvinists to consider ourselves first and foremost citizens of our states and then of the national government. That is not, even if I had lived all my life in Wisconsin, is not the center of my identity in any sense. My political identity.
Well, should we talk about 51 and separation of powers?
Yeah, let's get some more specifics. We've gotten a lot of how we're thinking about these things out, and I think that's been very helpful, but we need to get more of the text out before we say goodbye. You want to read part of 51 or sum it up?
Well, you had us read 48 to 51?
47 to 51.
Yeah,
51 is really the meat of it. 48 and 49 are really about this question of ways of revising the Constitution. And, well, I guess 49 and 50 are Madison's argument against referendum and revisions of the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
There is at the beginning of 48, talking about the notion of separation of powers. He says in the second paragraph, "It is agreed on all sides that the powers properly belonging to one of the departments ought to not be directly and completely administered by either of the other departments. It is equally evident that neither of them ought to possess directly or indirectly an overruling influence over the others in the administration of their respective powers. It will not be denied that power is of an encroaching nature and that it ought to be effectively restrained from passing the limits assigned to it. After discriminating, therefore, in theory, the several classes of power as they may in their nature be legislative, executive, or judiciary, the next and most difficult task is to provide some practical security for each against the invasion of the others. What the security ought to be is the great problem to be solved. I mean, that's, the separation of powers argument that governing involves legislative, executive, and judiciary powers, and they can encroach on one another, and we need to have a system of government that provides security against one of them encroaching on them too much.
Right, and it was a balancing act, and in one of these other ones, he goes through every single state constitution of how they separate the powers, and really none of them separate the powers completely, so if they're arguing that the proposed constitution doesn't separate them enough, well, no, it actually does pretty comparably to what some of the states are doing, and it's better than a lot of the state organizations in that there are more checks on one another, which will prevent legislative abuse, is what he's worried about.
That's what one question I was going to ask is, what disaster is the separation of powers actually avoiding? Is it mainly just legislative excess? Not worried about executive excess and judicial excess? Tyranny, but specifically legislative tyranny, or just tyranny by any of them, that they're all sort of equal possibilities?
I got the impression it was tyranny of the executive, having somebody who can execute the laws and create the laws at the same time.
So in this case, we have an executive who's neutered by not being able to create the laws. You just said the thing we're avoiding is tyranny.
Yes. According
of any sort,
that's what I read. By separating the creation of the law, the interpretation of the law, and the execution of the law, we avoid tyranny that can come from a combination of any of the two.
We're not supposed to be saying the executive branch, oh, it's good that they can put a check on the legislature by just not enforcing it. That would be a form of tyranny on the part of the executive to just override it like that. The specific power given to the executive is this veto power, which is overridable, of course. Mm-hmm. So it's not, as it sounds like, that, oh, we've put executive branch in its own slot. That's good. They don't have to go along with it if they don't like it. They can do signing statements. No, that's not really not supposed to work.
But interestingly, it's important that they not be wholly within their own sphere and completely disjunct from one another. It has to be the case that they can affect each other. So it's not just separation, but it's also checks.
Yes. Philosophically, I'm not sure what to say here because, yes, I agree that this is a good principle, and I'm not prepared to go through the history of how the judiciary and the legislature, for instance, have interacted and suggest tweaks to the way that it's done now. But philosophically, the only question I can come up with is this enough to do what they were trying to do, right? To prevent the kind of tyranny that they were trying to prevent. I mean, one of the things that jumps to mind is just that it really depends on what you consider to be a legitimate threat. What is a result of tyranny that you would be uncomfortable with? So if you're a really militant atheist, say, you might say, the fact that our money says in God we trust on it, and the fact that a law was passed putting under God in our Pledge of Allegiance, that is tyranny. Whereas I think the founders more had in line people actually being killed and things. That was the kind of persecution, not that they have to hear some words that they don't want to hear or something like that. But if you're talking about principles, yeah, I do think that if we're really supposed to have a separation of church and state, which I think has been the way the law is generally interpreted now, then those things should go away. But yet we don't have any legislative way of doing that. We don't have any political way of actually bringing that about. Should there be something that's in the system that would have prevented that from getting snuck in the first place? Maybe just a more explicit separation of church and state instead of just freedom of religion spelled in the Constitution? I'm not sure.
I guess it seems to me what you're pointing to is the problem of the disjunction between what you might say the goal of a particular society would be and like what its particular rules were versus the structures in which those rules get hashed out.
Yeah, the structures can never guarantee that the rules are going to live up to the purpose. They make it more likely. They can prevent the most horrible abuses. And if we spot some abuse like slavery or like certain kinds of discrimination, then we can jump in with a constitutional amendment or something. If we really say, yes, this just needs to stop, we need to put something really firmly in place. But there are going to be so many other things that strictly as a matter of principle, we should not be doing, or things that were in the law a long time ago that we just can't seem to get rid of. But until the actual political will comes along to do it, it's not just going to happen based on our great structure of government.
Part of those are genuine disagreements that people have. And isn't part of the answer that you see in here is that some people are just going to have to get over it. Part of this process involves, I guess maybe might be saying it not exactly the way they say it, is if you advocate for a point of view and you lose, that's just the way it goes. So I guess the way they would put it is that the factions work against one another, and some rise to the top and some don't rise to the top, and that's the way it goes.
So the ones that obviously jump to mind are things like gay rights and the civil rights things that have actually happened. But if you look at, say, polygamy as something that is claimed as, many of the same arguments are made for it that are made for some of the things that have successfully had laws protecting them or have brought about changes. But yet we're not in any ready path to approve polygamy as a society. And it's not even, you can't as easily make an argument saying, look, when you said all men are created equal, you should have been including the black men and you should have been including the women. Like, you can argue that based on what appears to be just rational consistency. Maybe it's a social finding that we've figured out that women and minority ethnics really are whole people. That's something we figured out at some point along the way. And so then we're open to that just argument from consistency. But with some of these other things, it really just seems to be a matter of just how the political winds blow. I don't know how polygamy is going to be looked at 100, 200 years from now. I just don't know. I can't obviously point to that and say, yes, they should have the right to that kind of marriage or whatever, or we should strictly apply the harm principle to that and just figure out whether it results in the abuse of young women, as I think is probably the case. It's a matter of trying to think about whether, if you're going to argue as a progressive, you have to argue sort of that it's destiny that these reforms happen based on the original intent of the framers. They didn't know. They thought they were people that approved of slavery and approved of all sorts of racism and sexism and things. But the spirit of the law says that they should be against these things. And so the Supreme Court could come up with something saying this is a right. You have a right to privacy. You have a right to abortion. You have a right to...
This is the argument that's had at the Civil War. Lincoln articulates this argument that the founding fathers, this part of the rhetoric is, was it consistent with slavery or not? And he's one of the several people who try to make the argument that the continuation of slavery was not the intent of the founding fathers, even though it was there. A couple speeches, he makes these arguments about the fact that it was put on a path to dissolution, and other events have come in the way since that founding, and he, at the very least, wants to see it continue on that path towards dissolution.
I just don't know if this is sort of a rhetorical game, the fact that we have to appeal to tradition, we have to appeal to the founding fathers' intentions, or the spirit of their intentions, is just some weird quirk of our society. We seem to feel like we have to argue everything based on God-given pre-existent natural rights, instead of just saying, let's do the utilitarian calculus or something, and we determine that this is a change we should make to the law. We can't just seemingly acknowledge that, look, sentiments change and we grow up, and so this is a movement forward we want to make. We always have to sort of read it back into the past and say, this is what they should have thought if only they were consistent with their own principles. Why do that? Why not just admit that there's growth and change, and this is something that we're arguing about politically now, and this is the position I'm advocating because of these strong sentiments that I have, and look at this gay couple together that it seems like we should grant them marriage. Why do I have to argue that we should grant them marriage because of some fundamental basic right? Why can't we just say it's a new thing we're coming up with? That's our rhetorical style. It's
not just our style, that's our myth. I mean, what it means to be Americans is to say that we believe that all men are created equal, they're endowed by their creator with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And our kind of eternal duty is to constantly interpret what that means in the current context. And not every nation on earth has that burden or that leisure, if you want to put it that way. It's the founding myth of who we are. The narrative of the United States is the narrative of progress, expansion and progress. 13 colonies, we expand westward, we expand, then we have Manifest Destiny, we have the Western Hemisphere, we're defending liberty in all these other places. We have certain stories that we tell about ourselves as Americans, and this is one of them. That as Americans, our dialogue with the founding fathers and with the founding documents of our nation is very similar to, I think, certain religious sects' interaction with the Bible or with their founding texts, in that there's a certain set of canonical documents which have to be visited and revisited in order to extract meaning and get guidance for how to act with respect to new cultural circumstances that arise. And the point you make, Mark, of why do we have to make this appeal? Why do we have to frame, okay, now we have electricity, so how does that impact? Why do we have to go back and figure out what the Federalist and Anti-Federalists had to say about, the advent of electricity, and how does it impact political theory? Why can't we just move forward? I think there's this desire to appeal to authority, but also this strong sense that we have that what holds our country together is somehow this connection to these founding documents and the principles that they theoretically espouse.
Isn't that just true, at least as far as the Constitution is concerned? It seems to me a separate interpretive question about whether we ought to appeal directly to the founding fathers and try to unearth what Thomas Jefferson might have thought about electricity if he had encountered it, or new kinds of the problems in patent law that we have and stuff like that. Or whether we should just interpret the Constitution that we have in light of current circumstances. Those are interpretive dispositions regarding how to understand the Constitution. But the fact is, the Constitution is the law of the land. And so whichever strategy you're going to take in terms of interpreting what laws there ought to be and how laws ought to be revised, what kind of give and take there ought to be, you're going to have a question, does that fit in with the Constitution that we have? And if so, you need to make that argument. If does it not, then does that require us to have a new piece of the Constitution? Then you have to do that. Otherwise, you just have to just get a new Constitution every, certain amount of time. So those are your options. And we see that happen, right? Amendments get made, they don't get made. That's why people want to make a marriage amendment. Why? Because the Constitution doesn't let them have that as a law right now.
Yeah. So, as a legal mechanism, I can see this is taken, of course, from English common law, that we start with what we have. We look at not only at the existing Constitution, but at the way it's been interpreted by past courts. And so judges are not supposed to be making a moral decision when it comes to their cases. They're supposed to be applying the law as it has been established. That makes a lot of sense to me because that's their function. They're not supposed to be legislating. And you could say, of course, there's fallibility built into that, and the judges are going to be influenced by their morality and whatever, but it's good to at least have that as an ideal. It's just the fact that when we're making moral arguments, not legal arguments, or when we're trying to figure out what kind of country we should have, we start with the default position that if you look at, say, the presidential debate, is not something that can even be disputed, is that the founding fathers were gods. If we're going to reinterpret, if we're going to pull a Reform Judaism or something on the founding documents, it has to be through a reinterpretation and not, certainly at this point, it seems like historically, I don't know if you could break down by year when all the various amendments were introduced and things, but we've become seemingly more conservative and more reverential about this as time has gone on, such that I just don't even see it as possible in our lifetime, our kids' lifetimes, for another amendment to be passed. Like, we're just never going to gain the kind of consensus on anything to pass another amendment.
Why would you say that? First of all, why would you say that the reverence of the founding fathers is more reverential than it was? The attempts to revere the founding fathers and set them on pedestals happened right out of the box. And the exact kind of discussions that we're pointing to right now about, how great the founding fathers were and what their intent was, and that we'll gain authority for our own position if we tie it back to that of the founding fathers, has been true for presidential discussions and senatorial elections for 150 years, 200 years, at least. I mean, since the beginning. That if this is consistent with our original interpretation, the presumption of which is that the original structure of the country was good, that ambition was fine.
I just can't see, they passed the Prohibition Amendment and then the repealing Prohibition Amendment. That's only 100 years ago. I don't see anything like that happening now. That just all the things that have been proposed, whether on the liberal or the conservative side, just can't gain enough traction. We are too in a political rut for anything like that to happen.
The last amendment was passed in 1992.
And what did that do exactly?
No law varying the compensation for the services of the senators and representatives shall take effect until an election of representatives shall have intervened.
So it's about something that's obscure enough that nobody gave a...
It's not earth-shattering. I'm just saying that
nothing that mattered can pass. I don't know. Obviously, I'm not going to be the most erudite about exactly how and when these things happen. This is just a sense that I've gotten about my hope is not so audacious right now about the possibility of real change. We've joked about in some other podcasts, I think there was some country in Asia, made it a part of their constitution that they're going to obey the utilitarian principle or something like it. That we're actually, if we figure out that it would make more people better off to do something, we have an obligation. The legislature has an obligation to do that. We don't have any kind of sense like that now at all. And I don't think it's entirely just a matter of us disagreeing about what the thing would benefit us would be. It's just there's so much inertia. There's so much, entrenched, not just partisanship, but also this, I don't know if it's just respect for the Constitution, and maybe you're right that that's a bad diagnosis, but things are not moving. Surely you know what I'm talking about.
It seems to me that statement, things are not moving, is something that I hear across the political spectrum.
Yes.
That's not a political progressive as a kind of political position. They're not the only ones that complain about that in that way, right? And so the question would be, is that complaint of lack of speed of movement or movement at all in the laws of the land, is it accurate, or would it be good for it to move faster?
Right. Is it a legitimate charge against the Constitution as originally set out? Because clearly what these guys were worried about was the government taking too much action and doing pernicious things. The thing that they were more worried about is, again, tyranny of the executive, tyranny of the legislature. They were not worried about entrenched non-governmental entities in society exhibiting sustained and horribly damaging influence and the need to somehow counter that.
Yeah, so in Hamilton's goals of developing a more mercantile country and looking forward to this modern state as being structured on commerce, it doesn't seem like he anticipated the rise of the company the way it is now, so that it becomes a kind of extra governmental entity.
Yes, that exerts legitimate power, which of course they recognize monetary power. There's monetary talk all over here.
You're talking about something else, Mark, than sort of economic power. It sounds like you're talking about things that laws don't address that happen as a result of abuses by companies that are sort of extra legislative or something like that.
Yeah. For instance, the whole culture of how employees relate to employers. Like, it's great that we've had progress, right? A lot of the progress has only been tangentially related to the law. So if we have laws saying unions are okay, that's a law that will affect these things. But the real relations are sort of what comes out of, I don't know if it's market forces about individual workers, so that you get, some companies that are more enlightened now that will offer more flexibility, stop making you dress like a monkey and be there.
You really want laws about that kind of stuff, Mark?
Not necessarily, but there are plenty of things that politicians talk about that don't have anything to do with what they can legally bring about. And this has been so from the beginning, so pretty much any politician talking about virtue at all, even if they don't use that word now, they're still talking about individual responsibility. Those are not things that can be legislated. But yet the attitude that the government takes toward these things will influence the whole tone of legislation. So for instance, if the prevailing political winds went so that the chief evil of society was seen as bosses' domination over their workers, it's hard to think exactly what kind of legislation would come out of that. I mean, certainly defense for the right to sue your employer in certain circumstance and maybe, better working conditions of certain sorts. But the actual legislation would go far short of what the culture itself can and would do. That's a lot of what the frustration that I have, at least, what our political and economic goals are ultimately seem short-sighted to me in a way that I recall even Thomas Jefferson. I heard some quote from him at some point about pretty much, we need to be good businessmen so that our grandkids can be great artists. I'm sure that's a massive misquote, but that is not a goal. And I think a lot of what is preventing us for even considering that kind of thing is a lot of entrenched legal interests and things. So, how hard it was to get even this modest change in the healthcare laws through. Is anything like that going to happen again in the next 15 to 20 years? It's hard to hope so. And those things all seem prerequisite to me to getting a society that is less focused on money. That was my going way off.
Yeah, it was a little, yeah. Okay.
Where were we?
Well, we were finding a little bit less traction in 51 in the question of separation of powers philosophically. Of the stuff that we read, the faction stuff seemed to be the most pregnant.
There were some points to be made about the sections on commerce.
Okay.
I mean, one of the things I found interesting about that section on commerce was just that the argument was essentially something to the effect of, we need to have a strong military. Part of the reason you want to not have a confederation of states that are all negotiating separately with foreign powers is that you want to have a unified stand and a strong presence with respect to your navy so that you can enforce import taxes. And, the argument that we should come together under a federal union so that we could have a navy that was supported by taxes and that we could enforce our trade.
Yeah, protect our commerce.
Protect our commerce, but it's a specific argument in there, which is that taxes on property and income, or at least property, are somehow not sufficient and not really fair, that what we should be taxing is imports and consumption. And to do that, you need to have a navy. It seemed to me that there was an interesting sort of connection between military might and economic power that basically suggested that you can't have one without the other, which may be obvious, but at the same time is somewhat weird to say out loud.
Right.
I think that we don't think about that as much now, to what extent it's important that we have Navy ships around the world preserving certain trade routes, even now, right? Which is clearly on the mind of Hamilton, that essentially our ships will get through and our trading partners will get their ships through if we have a Navy in order to back up what we want to do.
Yeah. It doesn't even have to be around the world. He mentions that we don't even have the rights to go down the Mississippi. Spain hasn't granted us those at this time. And, he makes a good point about how if you try to negotiate a treaty, or if you're trying to negotiate rates, if you don't have the ability to enforce, if you don't have the threat of power, your negotiating power is essentially non-existent. And so it's sort of an interesting and explicit expression of the connection between military might and economic goals, I guess you could say.
Yeah, it is interesting. And it's one interesting distinction between a sovereign government and a company. In general, companies don't get their way in trade by showing up at the other company's doorstep with guns. Right?
That would be kind of awesome if it was true, but yeah.
Apple's going to take down Samsung.
That's right.
That's the way it works in the drug world.
Yes.
That's true.
That's exactly right.
The cartels.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Now, there's probably a good argument to be made that there's other kinds of nonviolent extreme action that goes on. But
patent lawsuits.
Exactly. But I think that it is remarkably explicit in the Federalist papers about how military might is required to make the commerce of the new country successful.
And there's an emphasis on defending the borders and there's an explicit appeal to, hey, if you're one of those states that's bordering a foreign country, you should really want a federal constitution rather than some loose confederation, because you're going to bear the burden of having to defend that border. And it would be better for you if you had all of the resources of the entire union to come to your defense instead of relying on the good graces and your ability to persuade other people to help you. And that's, again, something that is much less relevant today, maybe, than it was back then. But I wonder, in the same way that you mentioned, Dylan, that, people underestimate the importance of our Navy securing trade routes, and that these are the kinds of things that I find interesting. These are the concerns that are being addressed at the time. Are they still concerns today? And if they aren't, or if not to the same degree or different in kind or some other sort of thing, then, Mark, like the point you were making about the appeal back to the authority of these canonical texts or the intent of the Founding Fathers, does it even make sense? And in a kind of form of closing comment, what I'm looking for when I read these sorts of things, when I read the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, is I'm trying to understand what are the philosophical underpinnings, what are the requirements for the democracy as conceived by the people who basically created this country, who fought to create an independent union. And what comes across to me, and by the way, we kind of gave short shrift to the anti-federalist position, and that in itself is certainly worthy of a whole nother podcast and set of considerations. But I'm not sure that I'm 100% allied with the Federalists just because they won. But basically, it seems to me that there's an assumption that you have to have, an educated electorate. They can be self-interested, but they have to be rational. And in my mind, rational has a strong connection to educated. And that there is an assumption of a certain kind of disposition towards struggling with that self-interest for the common good. And there's a strong association with the limits of technology at the time and theory, political theory, economic theory, all these different sorts of things. And I keep wanting to ask myself, do all these things still hold? Is our society still structured in such a way that the principles and the assumptions that were in place make sense? Because I think it's remarkable that the United States has existed as a political entity for a lot longer than certainly most European governments, and historically longer than many other what we consider to be the great civilizations of all time. So we are now an empire. We're now a paradigm for a long continuing central government, and we continue to focus and coalesce around these core principles, and we use the Constitution, it's our anchor. And part of me just wonders how it is that we continue to go on and how long we can continue to go on if at some point we begin to, the foundations that are required for the representative democracy that was created, envisioned, and that we've enacted and kind of put into place get eroded. So at a certain point, if you have an uneducated electorate that doesn't have the purchasing power required to fund the commerce. So that's another point in that commerce section, is about how our purchasing power is what makes foreign manufacturers interested in bringing their goods to our shores so that we can tax them on the way in and make money for the federal government. If we do not have the purchasing power, then we have no leverage. We have no interest from the world. And so if we don't have an educated populace that can buy things, then we have no foundation for our representative democracy. And I'm extremely concerned about that right now.
Nice. Just to return to the founding myth thing, and I like the way you put that, Seth, and it kind of bothers me that I do believe that it is good for us to have a founding myth so that it makes us less likely to lapse into totalitarianism, that the Nazi thing will not happen here, or is less likely because we have these foundational myths. But there seems something infantile about that and cynical. It's kind of like saying society needs religion or it will break down. Come on, really, are we that? Can't we have ideals without having myths? We have to believe that these are God-given rights. We have to believe that the founding fathers were geniuses and not just smart guys that studied Aristotle and made the best choices that they could, and they were difficult, and some of the guys on the other side had just as good arguments or better in some cases. I think if we could be properly realistic about their abilities and how what they were recommending was specific to their time and place and the circumstances and the audience that they were arguing for, then we could much more intelligently retain the ideals that they held, but shake off some of the details that maybe are preventing things that I would like to from happening. I'm curious from the two of you, like what, if you don't think it's just opening a huge can of worms, but if you could, like, what would you want out of government? What's not happening now? And would it require a change in any of the structures, such as those laid out in the Constitution? Or it seems to me like things have happened. The way the political parties are now have assured the kind of deadlock that cannot be broken without some sort of constitutional or legislative action or something. And it's not just a matter of this year or last year. It's a fucking long-term horrific problem.
I disagree with that. I mean, I think that there have been periods of deadlock in the past. I don't see how you're going to legislate away deadlock without legislating people's intentions.
Well, didn't Seth just raise an example of like how maybe the more coalition flavored governments rather than winner take all?
Yeah, I suppose one solution would be to try to completely refound the structure of the government. And maybe there would be things that you could do within even the existing one to have new rules. I mean, the two-party system is entrenched in the actual structure of the way in which the House of Representatives and the Senate do their business.
Which is not in the Constitution.
No, it's just their rules. Yeah. Just like the filibuster rule is just a rule. I, for myself, find myself partisan to a lot of progressive notions, but I don't see the solution as being desirable in terms of refounding the structure of the government. I myself think there's a lot more danger to doing that than there is positive things to it. You know, they've done surveys like this before where you go around and with a list of the Bill of Rights and you ask people on the street, here's some laws that are being proposed. What do you think of them? More often than not, actually, they will say that they think they're crazy. Ignoring the fact that they're not recognizing them as actually part of the Constitution. You have the whole separate issue that you might not get them out of a refounding of the Constitution.
There's more choices than starting over from scratch and leaving everything basically the way it is and just making laws within the current system. We've had changes like increasing the number of Supreme Court justices. We've had changes like how the senators are appointed.
Sure.
Getting rid of the Electoral College. There are all these things that could be changing in some specific ways the relation between the states and the federal government. There are lots of things that can be suggested that are structural.
I do not feel nearly as strongly as you do about the need to make fundamental structural change to some of those things. I'm not out of the box against it. To me, the most pernicious problem is the problem of money right now in politics.
Yes.
That's symptomatic to me of self-interested factions trying to gain control, and that it seems to me that the very problem was identified back in number 10, and that it continues to be a problem today. And it's not clear to me that the political structure that was proposed and implemented addresses that. In fact, it seems clear to me that it doesn't.
To swing to optimism for a second, I guess I can foresee that there are such sea changes. So, for instance, the recent Supreme Court decision that got rid of pretty much any sort of campaign finance by saying that corporate speech is free speech and that kind of crap. Right now, I feel like, oh, that's so intractable that the only way we could get around that is by changing the number of Supreme Court judges, letting Obama add 4 more people, that kind of thing, or passing a constitutional amendment that specifically says that corporations are not people. Just these things that are just not going to happen. But it's actually much more possible that the mood will simply change and that will be reversed in 10 years.
I myself politically was not happy with that decision. But the flip side of that is that there are lots of people that were, right?
With the Supreme Court decision?
With the Supreme Court decision, Citizens United, that said that corporate speech was free speech and took away basically all forms of campaign finance reform that made it functionally possible for individuals to donate as much as they want to political campaigns. And we're seeing that play out in the last election and even more so in this election, to the point to which a president is looking to raise $1 billion in order to run a campaign. But there's a difference between being on the losing side of a political argument and it being stacked against you. And that's, to me, sort of the question. For every one of the specific political positions you're making, those are live political arguments. And so you can either say that, well, all those people are just crazy and they're just wrong, and their wanting to make laws should just be denied because they're just out to lunch. That seems to me to be like not wanting to have politics. For better or worse, part of politics is losing as well as winning, right?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, Dylan. But there's also, I feel like I want to invoke an Aristotelian position here and say, is there not a point at which when you say the logic is so convoluted that the argument is that a corporation is a person, you look around and you think, how did we get to this place? How is it possible that that's even what's on the table? And how is that not some convoluted, torturous twisting to try to make something fit something for somebody's interests, as opposed to looking around and saying, what would a reasonable, virtuous person have to say about this? And I don't understand how the Supreme Court gets lifetime. Like, every Supreme Court decision I read, and it's not just this one, if you go back through history, the decisions are terrible in many, many, many cases. There was a point in there about where he says it's self-evident that, judges should not have terms, but other offices should. And that does not make, while I'm not in favor of having a system like we have here where judges are constantly running for re-election and they're allied with political parties, I don't understand how the Supreme Court, you get a lifetime position as an appointee of somebody who represents a particular political party. And there's no accountability whatsoever for anything that you do. I find that extremely distressing.
Right. Impeachment, unless they go molesting kids or something, they're not going to get impeached.
I'm not a fan of the Supreme Court. I don't know what alternative there is, but I don't like that one. Anyway.
Well, thank you for sharing your vision for the future of our country. Thank you for coming together in this debate, which I think we can all agree that Obama lost. Next time, we'll be reading 2 essays from Willard Van Orman Quine, On What There Is from 1948 and 2 Dogmas of Empiricism from 1951. You can find both of them in the collection From a Logical Point of View. Everybody go to partiallyexaminedlife.com, participate in a discussion on this or any other episode, why you can become a PEL citizen by making a small recurring donation that comes out every month and get access to a whole range of new discussion groups and resources and free stuff, and it's super sweet. We also have a Facebook group for you cheapos that just want to type in things from your phone. We have Twitter from people who don't want to read more than 140 characters. We can go to the iTunes store and give us a nice review. It would be really nice. We are donation supported. Recent big donors since last time we announced, which was 2 episodes ago, so there are a bunch of them, are Michael Ritzman, Andrew Hudson, Randall Helzerman, Leonard Williams, Dennis Murray Sr., Christian Albert, John Gautier, Louis Ware, Michael Pieri, Dan Buzatu, Joe Varro, Joaquim Schlock, Paul Peterson, Joni Davis, Jay Jung, Todd Costa, Scott Parker, Deborah Payne, Darren Stoddard, Mike Alwyn, David Menares, Robert Orient, James Hackett, Andrew Westman, Bradley Lau, Bruce Miller, and Stephen Aldal. Thank you also for all those that made smaller donations, including some of those that signed up for the monthly recurring $5 thing to be PEL citizens.
Yes, thank all of you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, everybody.
Well, good night.
Good night.
Good night.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Hey ho, what you go? Tint my memory with a passing glow, changing all I think I don't know for you. Fine fade, passing time, seal my senses with a glossy grime, dawn in full and resting my mind on you. I feel at home, but feel at home. I feel at home, I feel at home. You won't look back on me and feel you have turned away. You, when I was mine, come off empty with an S in line. Maybe the years will take off the shine from you. Love lost after touch, pray the premise won't amount too much. Pretty darn free but left in the clutch of you. I feel at home, I feel at home. I feel at home, I feel at home. You won't look back on me and crack on me and fade out into black on me and wither into fact on me and feel you have turned away. Hey ho, what you go? Wipe my memory with a glancing glow, changing what I don't care to know for you. I feel at home. I feel at